It's a PDF. Wizardry.
Right, recorders, are you ready? No answer. Chris?
Recording is already in progress.
We had no sound for a second. So Chris and Jeff, are you ready to record?
I'm recording.
Jeff? Okay.
Yes, we are already recording.
Okay. Our speaker went to sleep, so we couldn't hear you. Pete?
Thank you very much, Adam. Right, so I'm just going to give a few reflections on climate positive farming. So the food system is part of the climate problem. A couple of years ago, Monica Cripper and her colleagues from FAO published this analysis of the global food system, which showed that over a third of all global greenhouse gases emitted by humans are due to the food system. And this is just the breakdown. I don't want you to look at this, it's just show you a pretty picture of how you can follow through the greenhouse gases on the left of the slide through to the initial sources over there on the right of the slide. But a third of all our emissions are from the food system. That's why we're interested in talking about it. That's why agriculture and the food system have a role to play in reaching net zero. We're just you can't get the staff these days. Shall I try that? Bang. Right. And of that, a third of the emissions that we emit on the planet are from the food system. And most of those, as you can see, about 70% are from food production. So that's what we do in agriculture, and from land use and land use change. So 70% of the total footprint, we hear a lot about food miles, we hear a lot about waste, but most of it is actually down to production and land use change. So that's the thing. If we want to make a difference, those are the things that we need to target. If we have a look at how we're doing in Scotland, this is the Committee on Climate Change, the Climate Change Committee's 2022 report to the Scottish Parliament that looks at how we're doing. So I'm just going to try and minimize that. See if that buggers everything up. What? Ooh. I've done that. Yeah, I'm sorted. So this is the Scottish. This is how we've done with our emissions in Scotland. So we've reduced our emissions overall from about 65 megatons of CO2 equivalents to about 40 tons of megatons of CO2 equivalents by 2020. Our projected emissions are due to go up, but these are the current targets. So as a nation, we've not hit our targets, but we've done quite well. We've reduced our emissions quite considerably. But when you break that down by sector, as you can see on this slide, agriculture has hardly made any contribution to that. So if you look at the electricity supply in the middle of the graph there, we've had a great big reduction in our emissions from electricity supply. small emissions reductions in building, small emissions reductions in transport and in industry, slight increases in land use, but agriculture stayed fairly flat. So it's one thing that the Committee on Climate Change have chastised the Scottish Government for not doing enough to incentivise reducing emissions and creating carbon sinks in agriculture. The Scottish Government set ambitious targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture and land use emissions represent about a quarter of all Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions. So at the global level, the food system is responsible for a third, as I showed earlier. And in Scotland, just the agriculture and land use component, that's not including all the production and consumption and stuff, that's responsible for about a quarter of all our emissions. And as we decarbonise our electricity generation, as we move towards more renewables, then the share of that will go up. So agriculture becomes even more important to decarbonise. So as part of that commitment to reach net zero by 2045, the climate change plan requires the equivalent of a 31% reduction in agricultural emissions by 2032 from 2018 levels. However, between 1990 and 2019, Scottish agriculture only decreased its emissions by about 13%. So it didn't even meet halfway. So we clearly need to do more to help farmers to decarbonise in the way that Roger has described earlier. Where do the emissions come from in agriculture? So this is the pie chart of the emissions. What you can see there in the brown is from the arable sector. So these are mainly emissions of nitrous oxide from fertilizers. So the nitrogen that Roger was talking about earlier before he went organic, that stuff that he's putting on, some of those losses are going to the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. But that only accounts for less than a quarter of the emissions of the sector. If you look at all the other colors, the green, the blue, the purple and the pink are all ruminant animals. So the majority of our emissions in Scottish agriculture come from our ruminant animals. So one of the things that we need to do is, well, the thing to note is that our emissions are dominated by the livestock sector. We also get nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer use, and the methane emissions are the main contributor from ruminant livestock. So here are some promising options. There are about 100 options available that have been sort of postulated as being able to reduce our emissions. But of those, I've just outlined a few here. So firstly, reducing nitrous oxide emissions. That's from fertilization in arable systems and grassland systems. So you can reduce your fertilizer use, for example, with organic agriculture and the use of legumes. Roger's already spoken about that, how he's implemented that at Knock. You can raise soil organic matter levels because soil organic matter contains a lot of carbon. When you're locking carbon up in the soil, it's not then in the atmosphere. You're capturing it from the atmosphere, so it's preventing it from being in the atmosphere where it causes climate change. And you can do that by doing things like returning organic matter residues. You can use nitrification inhibitors. These are chemicals which can be added to the soil, which reduce the nitrous oxide emissions. Currently, we can't use them in the UK. They're banned, but they've been tested in other places in the world. In India, they use a chemical called neem, which reduces nitrous oxide emissions. And there were other ones that have been used in New Zealand, but they've stopped being used now because they were found in milk. So they had to be taken off the register. And precision agriculture and decision support tools, giving farmers better tools to manage the nutrient cycles on the farms is another way to do it. Next is reducing livestock emissions, methane emissions. The most obvious way to do this is to reduce livestock numbers. This is where farmers start to shout at me, and I'm lucky to get out of the room alive, because they say, we're producing them in this country, we've got a lower carbon footprint than if they were produced by deforestation in Brazil. But nevertheless, that we will have to reduce livestock numbers, or we can't meet our 2045 target without some reduction in livestock numbers. So the way we do that is to maybe work with the industry to focus on less but better meat, higher quality meat that's better, but with reduced overall numbers. And I think Roger said when he went organic, you had to reduce stock numbers on the farm to make that work. So this is one way in which it could happen. There are a few new dietary additives. There's one called 3-NOP, which is a great big long name, which I won't even try to say here. But these are still in development, and they reduce livestock methane emissions by somewhere between 20 and 30%, and that can be sustained. But these are still in development, and there are questions about whether we want them in the food chain. So there are some technical measures that could still be used. And the other thing we can do is we can use better manure and slurry management to reduce methane emissions from the manure and slurry. The next greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide. This is the one that we're all used to talking about. We can reduce on-farm fossil fuel use in transport machinery in buildings, for example, by using renewable energy. And we can also create carbon dioxide sinks. So that's things like planting trees, planting hedgerows, and using soils to lock up carbon, to sequester carbon away from the atmosphere. I've got a few more slides on that because it's a pet subject of mine. But the trees that Roger talked about in his plantation forestry and amenity forestry and in the hedgerows, when he did the carbon balance, all of that, the stuff that's giving a positive carbon balance on Knock Farm is all down to the soils and the vegetation, which is locking up some of that carbon dioxide, which is being released elsewhere on the farm. So there are a few things about ruminant livestock, which I don't really have time to go into, but they have been proposed. Ruminant livestock has been proposed as a method to tackle climate change, but there are a few problems with that. We can't really increase the carbon stock in soils very much because grasslands already contain a huge amount of carbon. What we're looking at here is how soil carbon changes when you convert from a cropland to a grassland. And after about 50 to 100 years, it starts to stabilize and it can't store any more carbon. And when you've got grasslands, that's what's shown up there in the red, they're already pretty close to full up. It's like having a bucket that's full of water and trying to gain more water in the bucket by tipping more water into it. It won't go, it's saturated and it can't be done. So really we can't rely on the soils in our grasslands to offset the methane emissions from the cattle. So back to the soils. So these are ways to lock up more carbon in the soils. You can either increase the carbon inputs. So that's adding more carbon, manure, composts, growing plants all year round, deeper roots that add more carbon to the soil. Or you can decrease the losses. So you can reduce your tillage intensity, or you can keep the ground covered for more time using catch crops and cover crops to keep the ground covered, to chop your residues and leave them on the soil to cover. So these are ways, just increasing the input or decreasing the output are the ways that you can do that. I mentioned reducing tillage. By reducing the disturbance, you reduce the losses. On the right-hand side of the system, you've got your normal tillage. When you plough the soil, you break up the aggregates that are in the soil, and that exposes the carbon to microbial attack. And then you lose that carbon to the atmosphere. It's respired and goes up as CO2. When you move to no-till or reduced intensity tillage, that carbon stays in the aggregates where it's locked away from the microbes and it's not accessible, so it tends to increase the carbon stock in the soils. Here's a few pictures. Right, I apologize, most of these pictures are from Argentina because I gave a talk to the Argentinian Agricultural Society at the end of last year, and I borrowed some of these slides from there. So they don't show Scottish conditions, but we can have a look. It's the same sorts of things that we're talking about. So crop residue management, this is showing the residues. Instead of taking them away and burning them, this is leaving the residues on the field so that the ground is covered, so it retains the moisture and so that that carbon is going back in the soil. You may have heard of regenerative agriculture, and one of the central tenets of regenerative agriculture is to try and keep the soil covered as much as possible. So this is one way to do that. That's through improved crop residue management. Another way is change cropping intensity. Over on the left-hand side, you've got a low crop intensity, and on the right-hand side, you've got high intensity. Here, there's pastures and cover crops going into the rotation. There's lots more material on the soil surface, and it's improving the quality of the soil and the workability of the soil. So improving those rotations. The diverse rotations, again, this is a similar thing. On the left-hand side, there's a soybean monoculture. This could be a monoculture of anything. Any of our East Coast farms have a lot of cereal monocultures, but by integrating grazed cover crops into the system, and by also including catch crops and legumes, you can improve the quality of the soils greatly and increase the amount of carbon that's stored within them. Diverse rotations, if you have crops which have a mixture of vegetation. So this is an example. It's a species with a large taproot that's breaking up the soil and putting carbon deeper into the soil. Cover crops, instead of leaving the field fallow after you've taken off your main crop, you can put in cover crops, which you then plow in, and that increases your carbon inputs to the soil. And if it's a legume, then it's even better, because that's putting nitrogen back into the soil as well and saving you money on fertilizer if you use fertilizer. Yep. So if that's done it. Putting perennials in crop rotations, that's again diverse crop rotations, including grass in the rotations, as Roger does on his farm. And integrating the crop and livestock systems. That's the way that we used to do agriculture, and that's taken place where we've separated our animal agriculture from our cereal agriculture. If we reintegrate those, that can help increase the soil organic carbon content. So the last thing I'll finish on is that we can't have a change in animal numbers unless we also have changes on the demand side. And the Committee on Climate Change have criticised the Scottish Government for not doing enough on trying to promote sustainable, healthy diets, which include less livestock products in the diets and more fruit and vegetables. And by making changes on this side of the equation, as well as changes on the production side, we can maybe get some more towards a more sustainable food system. So the reason this is important is if you look at the climate impact of ruminant meat, it's about 10 to 100 times worse than the equivalent from a vegetable-based source of protein. And you can do it by calories, you can do it by protein, you can do it by total amount. But by shifting a diet from the left side of the graph, with a carbon footprint of about 60 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of product, over to the right-hand side of the graph, consuming more of those products, pulses and beans being over there on the right, and meat substitutes, with a carbon footprint of maybe 1 or 2 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram. By shifting our diets more towards those and less towards these, it can have a great impact on reducing our climate change impact. And in fact, the Committee on Climate Change has said that the apparent willingness of the public to make dietary changes in the absence of any government pushing them in that way suggests to the Committee on Climate Change that in their more ambitious tailwinds pathway, they suggest that a 28% decrease in meat consumption by 2035 is achievable. And we need that, as well as the changes on the production side, if we're to meet our 2045 net zero target. So we can make farmers have a big job to do, and it's great to hear from Roger. He's doing his bit. We as consumers have to do our bit. It's no good reducing the livestock numbers if we just then import the meat from elsewhere, which maybe has a worse environmental footprint. We have to do our bit as consumers and reduce our overconsumption of livestock products. In conclusion, agriculture and land use contributes a quarter of Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions. There's been too little progress in cutting these emissions. That's threatening our 2045 net zero target. Livestock production is responsible for the vast majority of these emissions. Some people have suggested that grazing animals can sequester carbon in the soil and that grazing could even help to solve climate change, but the numbers don't add up. We can go into that a bit more later if you like. And Scottish government must grasp the nettle and reduce livestock numbers, but they need to do that in a way that delivers a just transition for farmers. So the key thing about the Scottish approach is it has to be a just transition. So whatever they incentivize farmers to do, it has to be a way that gives farmers another source of income and another way of farming. Aside from this, there are options to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and create carbon sinks, but we can only meet net zero targets with a reduction in livestock numbers, which mean changes on the demand side. Thank you.